The chill of a crisp autumn morning reminds us that Armistice Day is approaching. At this time of year, we pause to remember, each of us in our own way. But what is it that we remember? What is it that draws us back? What connects us to the Great War more than a century later? We're at that time of year where we pause to remember the Great War. Not just the Great War, of course. For many of us there will be connections to other wars. But for those of you who listen to this podcast on a regular basis, this won't be something that you do just once a year. For most of us, it's a daily thing. And in normal times, we'll be along the old front line, visiting those battlefields and remembering again and again. But what is remembrance now? What does it mean to us? And what ways does it manifest itself in what we do, how we approach the Great War? If we look across our social media timelines at the moment, we'll see that people do indeed remember in so many different ways. And there will be aspects of remembrance culture, perhaps we'll call it that will trouble some of us. But I like to think, who are we to condemn? Somewhere in there are the right reasons to remember. A personal connection to a faded photograph in a frame, a distant memory of a relative, a faint utterance of a soldier's name, perhaps long forgot, that somehow comes out of that past and is forgotten no longer. And remembrance, the act of remembrance, is something that now is no longer done by just a select few. It's something that grows on an annual basis. In the years that I've been living here in South Yorkshire and attending local war memorial services, the numbers coming along every year grow and grow. People feel a connection to this. Perhaps that in itself is a reflection of recent conflicts, but also perhaps a wider awareness of the generations that served in both world wars, and a desire to know more about that Great War generation, because it's now past and gone out of the sight of men, the last living witnesses of that war having faded away. When I first used to travel across to the Western Front battlefields in the early 1980s, I can safely say that in many respects the Great War was forgotten. There were very few visitors, and you saw very few fellow pilgrims when you made those trips. I walked along almost the entire length of the British front one summer and never saw another English-speaking person. Some of the older gardeners would say to me, in the cemeteries of the Great War, the silent cities along the Somme or at Ypres or at Arras and Loos, that they hadn't spoken to another English-speaking person for some years. And I've mentioned this before, I think, on the podcast, that in the cemetery visitors' books, which in those days were bound volumes that were tucked into the little register locker by the entrance to the cemetery, some of those went back to before the Second World War. There were entries from the late 1930s and the names of German soldiers during the years of occupation who had visited those cemeteries. So few were the visitors that those books went back decades, whereas if we looked at the same books, the little green folders with the loose leaf pages that we found in those register boxes during the centenary of the Great War, probably they lasted and went back for no longer than just a few months. The increase in visitors had touched the sort of figures that those battlefields got in the interwar period, that often forgotten period of pilgrimage when thousands, tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of English-speaking people travelled across to the battlefields. A different type of remembrance for them because it was much more personal. They were coming to remember someone that they knew, that they remembered, that was part of their lives, whether that was a family member or, for the veterans, a comrade or comrades that they'd lost in the trenches. A century on, and we now are a century away from the beginning of that pilgrimage period, when in the immediate years following the war, with the shattered landscape of the Western Front, travel was difficult, but as that shattered landscape was repaired, and like a phoenix those towns and cities grew from the ashes and were restored once more, the visitor levels grew and grew. But life and the world often goes in circles, and 2 decades later, in the 1930s, the veterans and the battlefield seemed somehow forgotten. There were books published that hinted at this. It was as if the public had had too much of the war, had been saturated with the stories of the misery of the trenches, the horrific deaths, the exposure of the lie of wartime propaganda of lines of smiling Tommies marching to the trenches. There was almost a reaction against the war. And then another war approached, and gradually that old war, that great war, slipped into obscurity. And in those early 80s, in the early years of the Western Front Association, when the last of the veterans were still reasonably healthy and could travel they did, often believing that it would be their generation's last nod to the sacrifice that had been made on those battlefields all those decades before. But that wasn't really to be the case, because veterans like Harry Patch continued themselves to travel back right up to those last months of their life, and then the veterans travelled no more, and the Great War centenary approached, and the numbers increased. And as that centenary came to an end, people feared once more, perhaps those of us that had been travelling for a while, that there would be, just like in the interwar period, a public reaction to the war, a push against it, to push it back into the corner, to somehow forget it. Perhaps it would be eclipsed by the remembrance of the Second World War, which was now moving into its 80th anniversary period. And while the numbers have dipped, and of course COVID has made that even worse, the interest in the Great War does not seem to diminish. It's a subject that continues to fascinate people, that people continue to discover at different points in their lives, whether as students learning about it at school, or in middle age or retirement, that long-held desire to find out more about that dark war, those pictures of the shell craters, the mud in the trenches, the gas and the wire, all of those myriad facets of the war, all those myriad faces of the war, bring people to it in so many different ways. And we've seen during this lockdown period this golden age of military history podcasts like The Old Front Line, but not just The Old Front Line. Matt Dixon's Footsteps of the Fallen, Peter Hart's podcast reflecting on his work as the Imperial War Museum's oral historian, and Matt McLaughlin and Pete Smith in their travels across the battlefields of the Great War. All these different voices have come together, and I hope that there will be more, because podcasts like these don't seem to be just some sort of fascination that we're drawn to in those quiet months of lockdown. They seem to have become part of our mainstream culture. We go to podcasts, all sorts of different podcasts for different reasons, and the ones looking at the subject of the Great War are amongst them, and I think are here to stay, and that can only be a good thing. And going forward, it would be good to see more and more voices. Millions of men served in the war. There's not just one voice, and none of us own this subject. And I hope that as we move beyond these times and the world begins to return to normal, we'll see a new podcast generation who'll give their view, their interpretation of the battlefields of the Great War. But at this time of year, what do I remember? What do I look back on? A number of things, really. And the first of those are the veterans that I knew back in the 80s and 90s. Yesterday evening I had a really great chat with Matt Dixon, who runs the Footsteps of the Fallen podcast. If you don't follow Matt on Twitter and his podcast, then please do so and check out the podcast that he does, because he tells some great stories in a really interesting and engaging way. Matt asked me about the veterans that I'd interviewed back in the 80s and 90s, and it made me think about them. So I thought in this Remembrance podcast I'd talk a little bit more about what I did and how I did it in tracking down the veterans and speaking to them in that period of the 80s and 90s. It began just after my first visit to Ypres in July of 1982, which will be 40 years, incredibly, next year. My two teachers at school, Roger Bastable and Les Coates, who taught history and geography, were Great War nuts. They were fascinated, passionate about the Great War, and Les Coates went on to write several books for the Trestle Publications Teachers Cooperative that published these books for the use of students, books that are still used by student visitors to the battlefields even today. And I'm pleased to say that Les Coates still visits the Western Front. He was over there in between lockdown last year, I believe. But Les Coates was also very, very interested in oral history, which wasn't particularly in vogue then, but he encouraged us to try and track down veterans, and that's what I did. I used to ask people if they knew any veterans, and in the town that I lived in, which was a new town in Sussex, people had moved in, particularly from London, and I tracked down quite a few veterans with London and London Regiment connections. And then someone mentioned that they knew a veteran of the Royal Flying Corps, and off I went to see him. He turned out to be an air mechanic who'd worked in the ground crew of an RFC and later RAF squadron, and had served with them in France and Flanders, and gave a fascinating insight to the young teenage me into what it was like to work alongside the pilots and see those aircraft head off into the sky, and many of them never to return. But in those early years, I did it in a bit of a haphazard kind of way. And then I got hold of a copy of Martin Middlebrook's First Day of the Somme and later his Kaiser's Battle. And I would say that I'm always grateful to Martin for so many things, really, for the fabulous history that he wrote and published in those years, and the incredible interviews that he did with veterans that became such a big part of those books. But also in the back of his books, he listed the veterans that he'd interviewed or corresponded with as part of his research. Now, this is something that you see in books on the Second World War and indeed other books on the Great War. But the difference with what Martin Middlebrook did is that he listed the towns where they lived when he interviewed them. And back in those pre-internet days, and I know many of you listening to this will probably think, was there ever a world before the internet? Well, there was. And back in those days, in your local library was a full set of UK phone books. And that meant that with a list of men with hopefully unusual enough names and a town, you could look them up in the phone book. Very few people were ex-directory, not listed in those days, and you could find their details. And being a cheeky young man, I would get these details, ring the number and say, "Are you Mr. Smith who served with the Middlesex Regiment in Mash Valley on the First Day of the Somme?" And the gentleman at the other end would say, "I am." And there would begin a conversation that would often lead to me going to visit one of these veterans. So that's how I tracked some of these men down. And I started by going through Martin's books and picking out the ones that lived in Sussex, where I lived at the time, and then went out to visit them. And I met some incredible veterans through that. Aubrey Rose, who served with the Queen's Westminster Rifles and was wounded on the first day of the Battle of the Somme at Gommecourt. An incredible veteran who gave so much and wanted to relate his story from the early period of his service in 1914-15 through to that terrible wounding on the Somme that ended his war. So that was the start of it. And then when I went off to university, I ended up going to what is now part of the University of Chichester. And I lived down on the Sussex coast, which is a big retirement area. And there were lots of retirement homes, and lots of people had moved from all over Britain to retire onto the sunny shores of Sussex by the sea. So I would track down some of these retirement homes and ring them up and ask them if they had any Great War veterans, and normally they did. They had several. And then I would put articles in local newspapers, offer them a little piece about a particular anniversary of a battle. Local newspapers were always looking for copy, particularly free copy from someone like me, and it would be a way for me to put an article in there and put my own details and appeal for anyone that was a veteran or knew some veterans to get in touch. So a few more came my way by that means. So gradually my little network of these veterans grew and grew, and some of the veterans would say, well, there's a guy from my battalion, who lives down the road in Hove. You should really get in touch with him. Here's his telephone number. And I would find more that way. So it just grew and it grew and it grew. And I found myself during my student years going off all over Sussex interviewing different veterans. And at the time, I presumed that a lot of people must be doing this. Why wouldn't you be doing it? But of course, it was quite a rare thing to do. Only a handful of people were doing it. Published authors like Lynn MacDonald and, of course, Martin Middlebrook, and those who would go on to be published authors like Richard Van Emden. He was doing exactly the kind of thing that I was doing in a different part of the UK at the same time. And all of us, Richard and myself and all the others, we were so lucky to have this opportunity, to have that time with the veterans. And by the time that period of actively tracking them down came to an end, I'd spoken to well over 350. I honestly don't know how many it was. Now, not all of those were men that I sat down and systematically interviewed. Sometimes I spoke to them on the phone, and it was clear that they wanted to talk about it in general ways, but not in any kind of depth. They were reluctant to do that, and I understood the reasons why. Having grown up with a father who'd fought in the Second World War, I realised now that I had quite an insight into the mindset of veterans that helped me understand these men and perhaps push their buttons in the right way. So there were quite a lot that it never went beyond a phone call or a couple of phone calls. I was quite persistent, I like to think, in trying to get them to agree to an interview. Others, when I went to see them, it was a disappointment. Not that they'd had a bad war or a difficult war or a war that had no historical interest, but that they were unable really to verbalise what their war had meant to them, and that they could talk about it in general terms and in a few specific terms in terms of equipment, uniforms, what the webbing gear was like, what it was like to fire a Lee Enfield rifle or a Lewis machine gun, but they wouldn't tell a coherent story. And there was nothing wrong with that. It just meant that it gave me a different experience. And again, when I look back on it, I realised that even those veterans gave you tiny little nuggets of information that were part of that massive jigsaw that the Great War was, and eventually you begin to piece those jigsaw pieces together. You never probably complete the jigsaw. That is one of the fascinating and rewarding aspects of studying something like this, is that you never know it all. No one knows it all, and we learn every day, and that is just a magnificent thing. So there were those type of veterans, and then there were others that I quickly realised that they were at a point in their lives, and I saw this again a generation later with the Second World War veterans, that they'd kept it bottled up. They were unable to verbalise it to their family, but a stranger like me came along, asked the right questions, pushed the right buttons, and it all came flooding out. And I think I've said it in this podcast before, I like to hope, I like to believe that I helped those men, that they'd wanted to tell those stories, they'd wanted to unburden themselves of some of those memories and had previously not been able to do it. But with me and people like me, Richard Van Emden I know had a very similar experience with so many veterans. I like to think that we helped them, and we helped them get to a point in that later part of their life where they could not necessarily completely live with these memories, but they'd put them to rest. They'd laid a few ghosts to rest. And in doing that, and in hearing those incredible stories, it was such a privilege that I think I only really truly appreciate how much of a privilege it was all these years later. And when I was out with my Ledger Battlefield group last week, I had quite a few teenagers as part of the party that come with their parents because they were studying the Great War as part of their GCSEs. And I said to them, if only I had Malcolm Vivian here, if only I had George Butler, Harry Coates and Reg Glenn and so many others, if only you could sit and listen to them. And of course those veterans have gone, but in many cases, particularly with the Imperial War Museum Oral History archives that Peter Hart worked on for so long, they are digitised and now online, and that generation can hear those voices and can find them in documentaries from the 80s and 90s, like A Game of Ghosts, which I recently linked to on Twitter and which I'm going to embed into this episode of the podcast website so you can see it. So if you go to oldfrontline.co.uk and you've never watched A Game of Ghosts, which is a documentary, BBC documentary from the 90s, which interviews a handful of Somme veterans, it really is probably the classic example of what it was like. If you want to get some insight into what it was like for me to interview men like that, that program is very much it, and I'll embed that in the website. So I discovered men who could give me small nuggets of information, and then others who could give this incredible story, this narrative of the Great War, of their experience. And I continued to do that well into beyond my university years, into the late 80s and into the early 90s. And then gradually I found myself pulling back from it. Why did I do that? Why didn't I just carry on? Well, I'd got to know some of these men very, very well. They were friends. They weren't just people that I went to interview from a historian's point of view. They became friends, good friends. And my dear old mum, who absolutely loved coming to see some of these veterans with me, she got very involved with them as well, and they became family friends. But they were old men, and the clock was ticking for them, and often that clock ran out and they passed away, and I lost them. And that, I would say to you now, when I think about Remembrance at this time of year, it's them that I think back to, and the stories that they told, and the men that they were, and the lives that they'd lived, so many different lives, from working class lads like George Butler, who'd lived as a tramp on the streets of Manchester, joined the regular army and fought right through the war, spent over 3 years on the Western Front, a working class lad from a northern city. And on the other extreme, Malcolm Vivian, public school boy, gone on to Cambridge, served as an officer, decorated, and so many others in between. Harry Coates is a classic example. He was a middle-class London suburban family. He'd worked in an office before the war. He'd done the Pitman's shorthand and typing course, which eventually got him onto the brigade staff of the 56th London Division after having served with the London Scottish. He went on to become a manager in later life in that interwar period, and then an officer in the Pioneer Corps in the Second World War. So they covered quite a broad spectrum of men. And when I think back to them, I realise how much I learned from them, not just about the Great War, but how to live your life. And I think that's the wider aspect of Remembrance for me, and the wider aspect of probably all of our interest in the Great War. There's so much to take from it. So much to take from it in terms of our own personal lives. We walk through the cemeteries, we see the graves of young men through to old men, men like Henry Webber, who died nearly 68 in the Battle of the Somme in July 1916 as the transport officer of a battalion of the South Lancashire Regiment, and killed by a shell blast as his transport wagons went down Death Valley round the back of Mametz Wood. So again, a broad spectrum of men. But what we see by walking in those cemeteries are lives unfulfilled. We often talk about the what-ifs on this podcast. What if men like Raymond Asquith had survived? How would Britain have been different? Talbot Papineau with Canada. What if these men had lived? Lives unfulfilled. And hopefully it makes us think about our own lives and what we should try and fulfill. The chances that we've had that they never had, and the chances that they gave us through their sacrifice. The outcome of the Great War for many people doesn't seem to be clear, but this for them was a struggle as great in their minds as the struggle of my father's generation against Nazism, National Socialism and Nazi Germany in the 1930s through to the Second World War. And when I listened to the stories of ordinary men who had gone through such extraordinary times, probably as a young man in my early 20s then, I didn't really realise the significance of the lesson that I'd learned from these veterans. But it was a lesson that I learned, how to be, hopefully, a better man, a better person, a better member of society, that duty to them was a really strong, imposing word and belief, and something that I've tried in my own life to carry forward as well. None of us are perfect. We make mistakes every day. But perhaps we can learn, not just from our own experiences, but from the experiences of others. And those men and those women that I interviewed connected to the Great War, I often say that they were as much victims of the Great War as the men that they'd lost and remembered themselves, like my Auntie Wynne, who gave me that button with a little sweetheart image of her fiancé who never returned from the war. And it was such a crushing blow to her that she could never tell me his name. She could never utter his name to anyone but herself without, I suspect, completely breaking down, and that never happened. So that little button that I have, which I've described in a previous podcast episode, sits by my Royal British Legion outline of a Tommy in my front room, and something that I see every day, and remember that, and remember whoever that was. He's my unknown warrior. I remember that every day. And I'm telling you these things because I know I'm not unique. Many of you listening to this will have similar stories, similar lessons learned from relatives and veterans, and just reading about the Great War and what you get from visiting the battlefields. But to come back to the veterans again, before we end this part of the podcast, the one thing that I learned from them is the war never left them, that they kept it bottled up. And when you talk to people, they say, oh, my grandfather never talked about the war. And these men, having gone through that conflict, and the people back home having been fed this diet of propaganda of smiling Tommies going to the trenches, and films like the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of the Yonne and so on, which gave them really quite a false impression of what war experience was like. When they came back and tried to explain what they'd been through, people just didn't believe it, so they kept quiet, except amongst themselves. But many of the vets that I spoke to then said that they never mixed with other veterans, that they decided that it was time to get on with their life and put that behind them, and they kicked it into the long grass, and eventually they found themselves walking into that long grass as they got to old age, and they could really ignore it no more. And I was there at that right time, and I saw it again with the generation of the Second World War as they got to a very similar age in their late 80s and 90s, my own father included. They suddenly wanted to talk about aspects of their experience that they couldn't do before. Experts in the human mind will probably have reasons for this, and I'd love to hear them. But what I remember is the way they used to talk about it, not in the modern terms of PTSD. They never even mentioned shell shock, to be honest. They would just come out with these very self-effacing statements. I'd go to see one of them and I'd say, "You all right, Bert?" And he'd say, yeah, I fought the Battle of the Somme in my bed again last night. Just a little simple phrase. I fought the Battle of the Somme in my bed again last night. And what he meant, of course, was that the war had returned to him and the memories of what he'd seen had come back and he couldn't sleep. And it's those things that I think of at this time of year, and those things that I think of every time I return to the old front line, because last week I was thinking exactly the same. And I often say that in working as a battlefield guide, in trying to explain this to new generations and new waves of people that want to come to these battlefields, I often say that the veterans are my conscience. They're the things that I think of as I travel around those places. When I'm telling people what the Battle of Passchendaele was like, what it was like to go over on the first day of the Somme at Beaumont Hamel, what it was like to dig underneath no man's land and lay these massive charges of explosive, I think back to the veterans and I think, I've got to say something that they would have been happy with, that would have meant something to them, to do them justice, not dress it up in fancy words or exaggerate it out of all meaning, because the truth of the Great War doesn't need any fiction. The truth of it shocks, amazes, moves people who know nothing about it. I find that time and time again on battlefield tours. And it changes them forever. The people last week who travelled with me to those battlefields, I like to think it's changed them. I said to them at the end of it, I hope it has changed you, that you will return, and some of these names and some of these places will mean something to you that it didn't mean before, and you'll carry that away and you'll tell some others. And that word of mouth remembrance of the passing on of this knowledge and these stories is how all of this continues. And to end with a thought on the veterans aspect of this, many of them used to say to me, I don't know why you're interested in this, a young man like you, why aren't you out there doing whatever? And they used to pause and say to me, when we're gone, lad, no one will ever remember this war. One of them said, one day, all that we did will just be a page in a book. And I suppose in so many ways they were right, but I'd like too to think that they might be looking down from wherever they are and seeing the waves of visitors that have returned to these battlefields in the last few decades, and the number of young people that go there every year in normal times, and they might have a bit of a wry smile on their face and admit they were wrong, and that the Great War is not forgotten, and it's much more than just a page in a book. So that's the veterans. Let's move on to the battlefields. The other thing that I think of at this time of year as 11th November approaches are the battlefields of the Great War, the old front line. I've often felt, and indeed often said in interviews, that it felt as if all roads led to the Somme and Ypres for me. Growing up on my grandmother's stories of her as a young girl in Colchester during the Great War, and seeing veterans returning from the Somme plastered in chalk and mud, of seeing her cousins and her brother march off to war and only her brother return, this lost generation of hers, country cousins who never came back, of hearing my grandfather's stories of landing the Lancashire Fusiliers at W Beach at Gallipoli, and growing up as part of that Airfix generation of kits and comics and war films and everything else. Military history was so much a part of my life, and as a child you don't see it for what it is, but it grows and grows within you and takes you down a path. And for me, it took me on that path to visiting the battlefields for the first time in 1982 with my school, with those two teachers that I mentioned earlier, Roger Bastable and Les Coates. And I remember coming back from that trip, my dad came to pick me up and we walked home, and I tried to tell him about some of the things that I'd seen, and I realised even then as a teenager that something in me had changed at that moment, that I'd seen a place that would be part of my life for the rest of my life, and I would always somehow return. And return I did again and again and again, and I lived there for a long while. I lived in the space of the Great War, in the space that those men of the Great War lived, and that changed my view of it forever in so many different ways. But as I grew older, I think that I appreciated the landscape in a very different way. I saw it for what it was, part of a wider landscape, part of the natural world, and the way that the trees and the seasons and the animals and the birds are all part of it, just as they were for the men who were there during the war in the trenches. I began to remember the stories of some of those veterans in the 80s and 90s who used to talk about bird spotting, with birds landing on the barbed wire in front of their trenches, and they'd make rough notes as to the birds that they'd seen. And then I came across a report by a British officer who catalogued the birds that he'd seen during the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and wrote a paper on it for the Royal Ornithological Society. But what is it that battlefields give us when we visit them? To read the word of history, the page of history, time and time again, gives us one level of understanding, but I think that certainly in terms of military history, to truly understand the course of a battle, the experience of men on a battlefield, then the only way to really get to grips with that is to go out and walk that ground. When you read about attacks up slopes in Flanders or across ridges on the Somme, none of this really makes any sense until we've walked that ground ourselves and seen those slopes and visited those ridges and seen that really in terms of ridges and high ground on Ordnance Survey maps of Scotland and Wales and other parts of the United Kingdom, these places are just bumps in the ground, but enough of a bump, enough of a rise to change the course of a battle. And it's that understanding of the geography of these places as well as their history that I think is a really important part of why we travel to these battlefields and what we get from them. But it's much more than that. We know that it's much more than that. We talk about it regularly in this podcast. It's the presence on those battlefields. It's the atmosphere that we feel when we go there, whether real or imagined. Many people talk about the atmosphere in High Wood or Mametz Wood or so many other woods on the battlefields. Walking that ground at night, which if you've never had the chance to do, I would recommend to see the battlefields lit by moonlight or in the intense darkness that places like the Somme offer, because there is such little light pollution in those places that you get in essence a feeling of what the darkness was often like on the Western Front. No longer permeated with star shells cutting the sky with red and green, or the crump of high explosive shells in the distance and the flash of their blast, but the darkness, this dark landscape that so many veteran authors of the Great War talk about, is really worth something to try and see one day. Stay in a cottage on the Somme, go to a bed and breakfast in northern France, walk that ground at night. It's all part of the different perspectives that we get through visiting that ground. And then, of course, across that landscape are the beacons of the Great War, the vast memorials like the Thiepval Memorial in the Menin Gate, but also the silent cities, the cemeteries, the soldiers' cemeteries of the Great War, whether the vast legions of the dead like Tyne Cot or the tiny comrade cemeteries that you find in obscure fields across northern France. Here we don't just connect with a history, with an idea, we connect with people, because each of these stones in the cemeteries represents a life that we can research, that we can discover more about the man that this soldier was. Who were his parents? Did he have brothers and sisters? Where did he live? Where did he work? What did he look like? There are so many rolls of honour, so many of them now digitised, that we can find photographs of many of these soldiers whose graves we encounter across the battlefields. And in finding that face lost in the darkness of the past, it somehow brings that name, that soldier, out of the past. And these stories of the men and women whose graves we encounter and the wider family connected to them become part of our own lives. And I'm sure for many of you listening to this, some of those stories, some of those men and women are exactly who you'll be thinking of as the 11th of November and Remembrance Sunday approaches. It was Rudyard Kipling who called them the silent cities, and we realise as we visit more and more of them that they're far from silent, that if we stop and pause in this busy world, in this busy life of ours, and just stop for a moment and listen, truly listen, we can perhaps hear so much. And we learn perhaps that the pages of the Great War keep on turning. We never get to that last page. We discover more each time we travel, more each time we connect with those places and walk along those beacons. And as we return home, we don't leave them behind. Somehow they come with us, because back home we walk in their world, what was once their world, along their streets, past their homes. We see their names on war memorials and on family graves in cemeteries. And as we travel and live our lives, the criss-cross paths of the Great War reach out and touch us, and we discover something purely by chance, something that connects us back to those battlefields, back to that generation that experienced the Great War, back to those fields, those vast skies, those open landscapes, back to those places we know so well along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod, Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.